Hello and welcome to Mandibil. This is another deconstruction of a Stefan Molyneux video. My nemesis, Stefan Molyneux, as they say. This time we are dealing with Hume's is-ought gap. And I just want to mention first of all that I'm not, jumping on every single freaking video that Stefan Molyneux might make, right? But since I am, consider myself a philosopher and someone who wants to present philosophy, I'm also interested in pointing out when other philosophers presenting philosophy are making flaws, right? According to my understanding of philosophy or my own approach to philosophy. And Stefan Molyneux is just the most prominent example of, in some cases at least, very bad philosophy, right? And there are some hallmarks in my philosophy, or there's some, you can philosophize here and there and argue, but at some point there's sort of a fork in the road, right? And Hume's is-ought gap is one of those, right? And to me, it's also the fundamental understanding of metaphysics, which is sort of a establishment of your reduction base, a philosophical reduction base, your understanding of knowledge, your understanding of truth, your understanding of objectivity, your understanding of what it means to talk about morality or doing ethics, and what are we doing, and all these are forks in the road. That at some point you reach a point where it's okay, it's either this or it's this, right? It's sort of, there's no way around it, right? And that's what's so freaking great about a philosopher like David Hume, which in my opinion is, if you take the history of philosophy, he is sort of a towering figure over all the other philosophers who are sophists to some or another degree, right? I mean, he's not perfect. I mean, it's absolutely not, but he does have some legitimacy in some respects, and people are still arguing these points that he pointed out almost 300 years ago, just like the is-ought problem, which has become known as, which was almost like a sort of a side comment or an additional comment after a long section in his book, where he sort of said, oh yeah, and by the way, there's this thing where people argue like this. Don't do that, right? Don't just argue like that and think you have done some philosophy, right? Just be more rigid like that than that, right? That's basically sort of what it started out as in 739 or maybe 41 or whatever. This part of his book, A Treatise of Human Nature, was issued or publicized. But since then, it has grown and grown and grown into sort of the biggest hurdle for ethicists. Anybody who's trying to argue for morality seems to have to deal with this sort of known as Hume's is-ought problem, right? Or Hume's guillotine, or Hume's law, or Hume's whatever, right? And in addition to that, it has been sort of overinterpreted and underinterpreted, and you're manipulated, and sort of it has become sort of a monstrosity out of, like this. I'm not specifically wanting to compare to religion, but the story of Jesus is nothing like whatever that original person might have been, right? And sometimes this, Hans Christian Andersen, the feather that becomes five chickens, right? When a story changes and changes and changes, and all of a sudden people think that because they were told by that person who have read what that person said, who has read what that person said, that they are actually talking about whatever Hume said back in the day. And nobody seems to actually have ever even read the quote from Hume's book. It's not that complicated, really, right? The solution to the problem might be very complicated. I'm not going to tell you about any solution, but I'm going to deal with what he's actually trying to say to you, so you understand what the problem is, so you're not going to try to attempt to establish something that you don't need to establish, or think there's a problem where there isn't a problem, or okay, maybe also that there is actually a problem where you don't think there's a problem. That might even be worse, right? So in this case with this video here called Reality is Compulsion, that title is nowhere discussed in the video. I have seen it a few times, trying to understand what the hell Stefan Molyneux is trying to say, which is kind of obscure, right? I'm not certain. He spends an hour trying to argue for how to solve the problem, basically not understanding the problem and, attacking it from another understanding and so on. It just like, and the callers or the listeners on his show who's asking the question are sort of, okay, I guess you're right, because I'm too stupid to understand this great philosophy by this great philosopher, prominent philosopher, right? It's like, and then he sort of patronizes them if they dare to ask questions when he's in the middle of a stream of consciousness, and you shouldn't, disturb my train of thought or something like that, right? So that's just a side note, right? I'm not trying to poison the well here, but maybe a little. I'm trying to prepare you for another load of crap from Stefan Molyneux, right? It's like, at some point, philosophy or presentations of philosophy become so ridiculous. At some point, you're going to say, this is just bullshit, right? I have to treat this as bullshit. It's like if you're playing chess with somebody, right? And they sort of, kick the board and, take a big dump on it and or something like that. You're not going to sit down and try to explain the rules for them, right? You're going to say, you're a fucking idiot, right? Get the fuck out of my face. Don't take a dump on the board and, kick over the... It's like you're on another level here, right? And I have this strong urge that he might have some thinking in his head, but when it gets down to explaining what he's thinking, there's no coherence to it, right? It's like, I even if I try my best to understand what he's saying, I can't wrap my head around it, right? That's dangerous, because there are two kinds of result or mental adjustment to this that you can have. You can either say, I'm going to reject this no matter what. Or you can say, okay, I guess it's me who's stupid, who doesn't understand great philosophy, so I am going to accept what he says. And he basically doesn't say anything. He actually he says from the start, and we can get into that later, because I'm going to go through, if not all of the video, at least the most important parts of the video, right? He says, there are ises, which is reality, and then there are oughts, which are in the mind, right? And then he just makes the delineation. The oughts are over here, but what you are experiencing and sort of discussing ethics and morality from is the ises over here. So he's actually saying that the oughts can only be in your mind. So they can't be a part of reality. So no matter how you talk about reality, the oughts will only be in your mind. And then he proceeds to attempt to violate it, right? Somehow when you make this claim, there appears an ought or something like that, right? It's sort of a fluffy thing, like, get the fuck out of here, right? Okay, we'll delve much deeper into this. But first of all, he also violates one of these sort of his own cardinal points, which is whenever you criticize. So he made a very long video recently called something like how to go insane, where he talks about this guy who supposedly wanted to debate him about his metaphysics and his morality and whatever, right? And then he didn't show up, apparently, that guy. And then Stefan Molyneux makes this video where he, for almost an hour, tells his listener how stupid this idiot is, right? Because for one of the reasons is he doesn't bring a quote about what he's talking about or what he's criticizing about Stefan Molyneux, which was also something that we dealt with in the video with rationality rules, where he sort of rationality rules actually quoted from his book. And then Stefan Molyneux said, no, you don't use quotes because it's dependent on the whole book, so you can't use quotes, right? So Stefan Molyneux, if he wants to say, well, you can't use a quote because it's dependent on the whole book. And if you sort of, okay, I take a whole book approach to this, and I'm saying, okay, you are presenting this idea, this, no, then he says, you have to bring the quote, right? So he's sort of a manipulating bastard who will bring out the other thing that you're not doing, whatever you're going to do, right? But I would say if you're going to criticize someone about something they wrote in a book, it's a good idea to bring the quote, right? And sort of deal with the quote and try to understand what the quote is actually trying to establish or argue for, right? But he never does that with Hume. Not even in his book about ethics. He says the first ground rule he has is he is going to adhere, at least that's my understanding, right? You can't get an ought from an is, right? That's the first ground rule. I don't know what ground rules is in philosophy. That's a concept, an idea he has invented, right? But okay, that is like, it's sort of a self-imposed limitations of his philosophy or something like that, right? But at least he mentions Hume, and he says the first ground rule is there's no ought from an is, right? Why doesn't he bring out what Hume is trying to say? Because actually Hume doesn't say you can't get an ought from an is. That's a misinterpretation of Hume, right? So why don't you grab your own tits and then go back to the is-ought problem, or what quote from his book called A Treatise of Human Nature that actually describes what he says, right? That is the quote that everybody is dealing with when they're talking about the is-ought problem, right? Okay, so since Stefan Molyneux is not going to do it, then I'm going to do it, and it's right here. If it should show up on the screen here. And this is from Wikipedia, the English version of the is-ought problem. And Hume discusses the problem in the book. Well, the problem is not something that Hume discussed. Hume identified the problem, right? The problem is something that Hume created or pointed out there's actually a problem here, right? And that the point is exactly that before him, nobody seems to understand that there was actually a problem here, right? Okay. Hume says, and this is sort of 1700s English, right? But it's decently understandable. It's not very complicated in my opinion. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I've always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes a being of a god or makes observations concerning human affairs. When all of a sudden, right, I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. Okay, so this is the first part of his description. What he's trying to say is, every system of morality which he has hitherto, he doesn't say that he has read all books about philosophy, but he apparently has studied what other philosophers tend to do, and people in general, when they argue, when they you have discussion down at the pub, or invite people at your home and you're discussing philosophy, all they seem to be doing is start out by describing the world by saying that's the case, that is not the case, this is the case, that happened, this didn't happen, that happened, right? He doesn't distinguish between being and happening. So that might be something that could be sort of a criticism of Hume. But I think it's just, truncating everything into is, which is something happening is based on something that is, that moves around with reference to something else, right? So that something else is just something that is. So to cut it short, it just says, well, it's some kind of description of what is and what is going on, right? And then suddenly, after a bit of time, when they sort of make statements about that reality, or maybe a memory of a something that happened yesterday, maybe, right? But let's say it's just, something that happens now, right? Which it could have been, they would have made the same judgment if they were actually in that situation, right? Then they all of a sudden start to say, and therefore you should or shouldn't do, or you ought or ought not do, right? And please take a notice that he is so wise to say, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. He doesn't say that there's something magical about the word ought, right? He said it's not connected with an ought, which is another way of saying, in my opinion, that the ought or the ought not is a placeholder, is a generalized term for any kind of moral statement, which is something you should do this or you shouldn't do that, something like that, right? Anyway, that what people don't always say ought, they say should, or you're obliged to do, or your duty is to this and that or the other, right? All kinds of moral statements, which he says they are all connected with an ought. That's why he used the term connected with an ought. There's nothing magical about the term ought, right? It's just a term that he chose to use as a placeholder for all moral statements, right? Connected with an ought. He's not saying it's the ought that is important, it's whether or not it's connected with an ought, right? He doesn't even say it's about morality necessarily, right? He says it's connected with an ought. It's sort of a categorical, right? It's the description of the world that turns into be a categorical imperative all of a sudden, right? It's like, you should or shouldn't do this. There's no, well, if this is the case, then you might do this, right? It's, this is the case, therefore you should do, kind of. You ought to. There's a demand in it, right? So they're jumping from a description of the world, all of a sudden going into categorical imperatives, to use Kant's term, right? That doesn't work, right? And that is what he's going to tell you here in the next part, which is this change is imperceptible, right? Now, this term imperceptible might have different kinds of connotations. He might refer to it's imperceptible in the description they're talking when they are making this argument, string of arguments. There's nothing that can be perceived in the description that you can point to and say, that's why I'm going into these categorical imperatives. But it might also point to a more foundational thing, which is there's nothing that is empirical, perceptible. There's nothing empirical in the description. Or he's generalizing maybe even by say, well, there is nothing that you can point to, even if you tried to bridge this gap. This gap wouldn't be something that could be perceived. Now that's open for interpretation, in my opinion, what he means there. But he's actually trying to point to that gap that is there. If you're going from something that is perceptible, with something that is more like a sort of commandment, where does this ought thing appear from? If you're describing the world and then jumping into commandments, it must be something you perceive over here on the is side, right? Otherwise, you're just bringing it by yourself, and who are you to bring something in? It's just your fucking opinion then, right? So, in the only other possibility is that, well, it's because you describe that thing, so you must be able to perceive that sort of ought, and that's why you have that ought over on this commandment side. But then he says, well, how can you perceive that? How can you perceive an ought? There's no oughts anywhere, right? What color does an ought have? What sound does an ought have? What feel does it taste and smell? It has none of these things, right? Not as far as I have never experienced an ought, right? So where the hell does it come from? You can't just invent it and say, oh, I've created an ought here, right? So that's what he's trying to say. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. And I'm not quite sure what last consequence means. It's sort of 1730s lingo. So, but it sounds like it's in the end, this has the greatest of influences on your understanding of what you're doing, right? Of the last consequence, it sounds like this is, this is the fork in the road kind of thing, right? I was talking about before. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it's necessary that it should be observed and explained, right? You should be able to observe it. That's what I'm referring to before. If you're starting to talk about oughts in this chain of reasoning or argumentation, there should be some ought on the sort of the premise side before you get to the conclusion ought side, right? Otherwise you can't, there should be some ought thing over there in the is's. Since you can derive or, deduct some kind of ought in it, right? And that's what he's trying to say here, in my opinion. A new relation, affirmation, there should be something that relate in those is's to those oughts. There has to be some connection of some kind, right? It's necessary it should be observed and explained. At the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be deduction from others which are entirely different from it, right? An ought is completely different from an elephant, right? Or a fence, or a cloud, or a person, or a car. No, there were no cars in Hume's time, well, but fried chicken, some whatever. And then sort of these oughts appear, these commandments appear from observing a fried chicken or a bicycle, right? There weren't even bicycles back then, I suppose. But, a tree, a sheep, right? Sheep walks from A to B, and the person there, a tree, and therefore you ought. It's like, where the hell did that ought come from? No matter how you describe the world, and no matter how great or deep your knowledge is, or your understanding of truth or objectivity, and you will never get to any ought from there. So there's no point where you can sort of say, okay, now I established the ought, right? Because it doesn't come from that which you're describing. So you can describe the world from now for 60 years. You will never get to the ought, right? But as authors do not commonly use this precaution, he is referring to people who write about ethics. Use this precaution. I shall presume to recommend it to the readers, and am persuaded that this small attention would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality. And let us see that the distinction of vice and virtue is not founded merely on the relation of objects, nor is perceived by reason. Now, this last part, perceived by reason, that's a contradiction in my opinion, right? You can't perceive reason because perception is, in my understanding, your experience of the world, right? So he's sort of misusing terms here, right? But I'll let that pass, right? Because I have an understanding what he means. You can reason your way to a commandment, right? Now, if you can't reason towards it and you can't perceive it, there's no chance in hell, right? In my opinion. So you have to reason towards a moral principle, but it has to be founded somehow of a relation between what is and what should be, right? There's no way around it, in my opinion. You have to bridge Hume's gap. I can't see any other way around it, because no matter what, then you're referring to something in reality which you find for some reason immoral, let's say, right? And as soon as you talk about reality, then it's Hume's is or gap, right? And then there's something over here where you say, well, it ought to be like this. So bridging this gap is of huge importance, in my opinion, right? Now, there's all these, Immanuel Kant, the deontology, which is duty-based, when you reason your way to morality, which is that which Hume says you can't do, I would say you can do it, or that's the only way you could possibly do it if you can't do it, right? But it's not like you have to understand what is going on in the world before it happens, because you can't do that, in my opinion, right? That's what the ontologists, the duty-based, are going to say. This is what is going to happen in the world, therefore I can predict it, therefore I can adjust my actions, and then things will be all right. Yes, that's what you're going to do, but you can't predict what is going to happen. And if the prediction is what is based, your morality is based on, then you're trying to go the other way. Instead of looking behind you and say, this is what happened, that's why I need this commandment. He's instead going into the future and say, this is what might happen, and now I'm going to adjust myself before that happens, so I don't have to look at Hume's is-ought gap. I'm adjusting it before I reach the is-ought gap. Now, in my opinion, there's some reasoning behind that is good, because it has to be before it happens. Before, when it happens, if there's a murder or a rape or something like that, morality didn't work, and you can't use that which went wrong to describe how it should be right. Right? It's not the cars out in the ditch that you describe in order to figure out how to drive a car. Right? It's all the cars that is on the road that is your way to figuring out how to drive a car, right? Okay, so this is it is very important, at least, that you understand what Hume was trying to say. Now, you might have your own ideas about what Hume is trying to say. This is my interpretation, right? There's a bit of interpretation of what he means, and I think it's important to make this interpretation and be skeptical, just like Hume was, right? Be skeptical about what Hume, he would say, be skeptical. I'm sure he would say, be skeptical about what I'm saying, so you don't run with it, right? Because people have started to say that Hume is saying that you cannot get an ought from an is, right? That might be the case, but the problem is that's not what Hume is saying. He's just saying that, as he says here, to quote him, for as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it is necessary that it should be observed and explained. A reason should be given for what seems inconceivable, right? Now, him saying that it's inconceivable apparently has been interpreted as it is impossible, but that's not the same thing. 300 years ago, it would be inconceivable to think that it would be inconceivable, but that human beings could fly, right? From Europe to America. It was like, well, it can't be done, right? It's ridiculous. It's inconceivable. You couldn't say, well, it's impossible. It's like, nah, I guess it could be possible 300 years ago when Hume was living, right? If somebody said, you can fly from Europe to America, right? They say, it sounds like it could be possible, but it's inconceivable to me. That was how Hume would possibly express it, right? But that something is inconceivable is not the same as it being impossible, right? It's not impossible to fly, but you can't say that it's impossible, right? How would you argue that it's impossible to fly? How would you argue for that, right? So you have to see, well, I can't see how you could do it, right? But that doesn't mean it is impossible. So there's a very, very, very important aspect that has been, in my opinion, misunderstood. Inconceivable is not the same as impossible. And I'm sure that Hume understands this distinction. He thinks it's very difficult to argue this way, and with good reason. I mean, yeah, sure. And it seems so, because what has eventually turned out later, in Hume's day, his book didn't receive any attention at all, or basically no attention. And it was sort of a few hundred years ahead of his time, right? That's why it's so great, in my opinion. It's the only idol I really have in philosophy, right? Of other philosophers. He simply was years ahead of his time, right? We had to get into like, existentialism and psychology and Freud and Jung and all that before people start to say, hey, Hume was actually on the right track with this, right? I was going to, there's a point I wanted to mention. I forgot. I forgot there's some point I was going to make. I just forgot because I went on that tangent. But let's get into Stefan Molyneux's video, shouldn't we? And it's called Reality is Compulsion. Can we get an ought from an is? Yeah, let's just head into it.
Okay, so yeah, the question or the issue is around the is-ought dichotomy. Is that the major thing?
Yes, entirely correct.
And do you want to formulate the question?
I'm not sure if it's reasonable to call it a dichotomy, but I'll let that pass, right? There's sort of, it's not that whether or not you can make the distinction between is and ought. It's more like, how do you connect the ises with the ought, or how do you get the ought from ises, right? That's more the problem that Hume. So what Stefan Molyneux is already sort of triggered into, the ises and the oughts, and then there's a dichotomy, and there's a wall here, and it's so, right? It's like, I don't know, it's like from the right out of the gate, he doesn't understand what Hume is trying to say. He sort of overinterprets it and feel like it's sort of an attack on his great philosophy or something like that, right? You feel that, I feel that constantly when listening to Molyneux. It's like there are all these weird philosophers out there who's trying to attack him, right? Reaching out through time 300 years ago, Hume is trying to bring down my philosophy. Oh.
Or
Yes. This statement, you cannot get an ought from an is. It's a not or an is statement. That's the base question.
Sorry, I didn't quite follow that. If you could say it again.
The original David Hume's statement is a not statement or an is statement.
Well, it's both, right? So the ought exists in consciousness, and the is exists in reality. And so,
okay, so already here he is displaying his lack of understanding of metaphysics. He is dichotomizing his experience into his consciousness and something that is outside his consciousness. That's the only way you can. And reality is that which is outside consciousness. But then he doesn't, he doesn't what's the word I'm looking for? Realize that he's actually saying that, yes, I have some experience in here, and then there's something outside my experience, which I apparently also have understanding of. But he should say, well, how could I have an understanding of it if it's not a part of my experience or my consciousness, as he uses the term, right? If I'm not conscious of it, how can I have access to it, right? How can I talk about it? How can I refer to it? How can I say anything about it? If there's something outside my experience, then you can't experience it. It's in the words, it's in the understanding you're saying. You can't say something and then proceed immediately to violate it. That's ridiculous. That's so bad philosophy. It's like, it's unbelievable, right? If it's outside your experience, it's not knowledge. You have no access to it, right? Otherwise, it would be a part of your experience. How do you square that circle, man, right? If you're saying it's outside my experience, then you have to say, I can't say anything about it. And then there's this realm that I do not have access to. Then if there's a realm you do not have access to, the only thing you can say about, okay, I have an idea that there's a realm I do not have access to. And how do you deal with that? You can't refer to anything in it because you don't have access to it. You can at most say, well, my experience, the experience that I have, is some kind of representation of that, right? It's not the thing itself, because the thing itself is disconnected from the experience. Otherwise, I would be the thing. I wouldn't need the experience, right? You can't say you're disconnected from something and then go proceed to talk about that thing as if you have access to it, like what are you doing, right? You have to get this fucking metaphysics figured out, right? It has to be straightened out. You are violating your understanding of metaphysics.
So the presupposition or the basic belief that drives the relationship between is and ought is oughts do not exist in reality. They exist in consciousness. But the degree to which consciousness claims as a value the purpose of accurately describing reality unites the is and the ought. So if we ought to say things that are true.
If we ought. Oh, please take notice, right? Now he's making a hypothetical, right? He's going to transform a hypothetical into a, what's it called? The other one. Not a hypothetical empirical, but a, what's the other one? Categorical. Excuse me, I'm a little tired apparently. He's going to transform a hypothetical into a categorical, right? He's going to say, if you want, if this is the case, right? Let's just do it right now, right?
About reality, right? Which is saying that there is a conditional in the mind that does not exist in the universe. And although this sounds off,
there's a condition in the mind that doesn't. What are you saying? How do you know? Fit with what? Another part of your mind, or that thing outside your mind you do not have access to? Apparently, according to yourself, while you still then proceed to say that you have access to it. Where's that access? Are you circumventing your experience and going beyond your experience and getting to whatever? This woo-woo shit? What are you doing? What are you saying? Right? It's ridiculous.
Odd. I mean, it's very common, right? I mean, so E equals mc squared. Does it exist in reality?
Well, no. It's really hard to answer this.
It is. It is and it isn't.
Now, E equals mc squared is a kind of abstract generalization of experiences, right? You experience this thing falls like that, and this moves like this, and this has this color, and this is that color, and so on. And you try to generalize it into a formula that says, if this is the case and that is the case, this is what is going to happen, right? This is what is going to happen, and this is what is going to be the case. And I define energy as this, and I define light speed as this. I define mass as this, right? So it's like, well, it's like, yes, it's based on an experience, but that which is based on doesn't mean that abstraction you have made called E equals mc squared suddenly becomes a part of that reality from which you derive that formula, right?
We'll get there, but I mean, so don't feel bad about this being tricky. It's horribly tricky. I mean, to me,
it's horribly tricky. So the is a problem is horribly tricky. Yeah, but what are you saying? One thing is to understand what Hume is saying, and that's not very tricky in my opinion. I just, went through the quote earlier in this video, and if you think it's tricky, I mean, it's not like reading, Dan Brown's the Da Vinci Code or something like that, right? But it's not very much more difficult than trying to understand what it's saying. People have all sorts of preconceived ideas about what Hume is saying, and then they put that into Hume, right? It's not Hume's fault that people think that you can't get an ought from an is. That's not what he's saying. If you go through the quote, he doesn't say that you can't go, right? So, but he doesn't say you can either, right? All he begs you to do is give a good reasoned argument for how you get from these is's to these oughts, right? That's all he asks. Please give me a good explanation. And what he has apparently observed is whenever people are told to give an explanation, they can't, right? They can only mumbo jumbo words around just like Stefan Molyneux does, or they can say, I don't give a shit, right? And they probably come with us. Well, it says that in the book, in the Bible or whatever, right? It says here the Ten Commandments, so it's written, right? It's written, like the the Muslims say, it's written in the book, so it's true, right? Bullshit. And I think that what people have realized in the years after, in the centuries after Hume, is that when you dig down and deconstruct people arguing for morality, they are always violating this distinction between is's and oughts. They always make this leap as if it's just there, right? But when you deconstruct any kind of argument, it's always a problem of connecting these is's with these oughts, right? It's everywhere. It's everywhere. Everybody's violating this all the time. And they use some kind of, well, it's 300 years ago now that Hume wrote it, so I don't have to take it seriously, right? Something like that. Or like Stefan Molyneux, they're going to juggle truth and objectivity and, not violence, empiricism, and if you make this claim, then it could be interpreted as an ought, and therefore you've created an ought, and therefore, ought, right? No, that's not what he's tempting you to do, right? He says, if you cannot explain very precisely why there's all of a sudden dealing with an ought, right? Then you can't do this. So, trying to establish this connection between is and ought is, at least that's what Stefan Molyneux gets right in this. But his understanding of what Hume is basically saying isn't there, in my opinion, right? He thinks it's like Hume is trying to destroy your ability to moralize, right? While Hume was actually trying to do some morality in his whole book, his treatise of human nature, was the subtitle was something like trying to apply the sciences and empiricism to understanding of morality. And basically, his approach was not to how to argue for it, but removing all the bullshit and see what was left, right? Using empiricism to remove all the bullshit that people are saying, right? Just like with this art. This is the case, that is the case, the moon and the stars and everything moves according to these laws. Okay, but that doesn't mean you can start to say ought, right?
Is horribly tricky and it's perfectly understandable. So E equals mc squared. Does the equation exist in reality?
The equation doesn't. It's just a concept.
Right. So there are three ways in which we can...
I would say an abstraction, an inducted story, or something like that, right? Concepts are like elephant, right? When you're referring to elephant, you are referring to the concept of elephant. Elephant can be concept. Cloud, tree, car, individual, human being, dog. These are concepts. E equals mc squared is an abstraction. There are labels of this is understood at this and this is understood at that, and sort of mass is not a concept, right? Mass is an abstraction about the amount of matter in a certain place, right? Light speed is not a concept because it's a sort of attempt at describing how fast something moves in relation to something else. Okay.
You can answer this, right? So the first is, it does exist in reality, and that would be the Platonic argument, right? That there's a higher reality of perfect forms, and the equation describes that. The second is to say, it does not exist in reality, except...
Well, in this case, it's a kind of a, it's not like there's a realm outside your mind where you can go, or you were born in that, and you floated around it, and when you came out through the birth canal, then you left that perfect realm that apparently is inside women or something like that. That's sexism, right? But mathematics is a perfect world, right? A straight line is also always a straight line in mathematics or in geometry, right? A sphere is always a perfect sphere. When you're saying sphere, it's not like, well, this day it's a little bent on this side, and the next day it's a little bulge on this side. No, it's always the perfect idea of a sphere that doesn't exist anywhere in reality, because you can always zoom in and say, well, it's not perfectly, spheric shape or whatever, right? So there is some kind of perfect world, but that's a part of our mental capacity, right? That's possibly a part of our cognitive abilities, right? Or the I or the me in that which is conscious about my experience. So there is some part of perfect world in your mind in this sense, like mathematics, and that's why you can't do mathematics. Otherwise, if these shapes or abstractions weren't perfect in your mind, or you didn't treat them as perfect, or if you get right drift, right? You wouldn't be able to do mathematics on it, because you will always have, well, this line is slightly bent over here, and that shape is slightly bent there, whatever, right? So it's a unique shape. Now, all circles are circles in mathematics or geometry, but out in the real world, there's nothing, it's all unique, basically, right? But for you to get around in that world, you need to treat something that is basically flat as being flat, right? The earth is more flat than it's round when you're walking out. It's not like, oh, I have to be careful that I'm getting over on this side of the globe, right? No, you're treating it as if it's flat, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be cars if you were sort of afraid of going around right? Something like that. So your everyday is where you are, what you're dealing with, but to generalize things, you're using these kind of approaches. Like, look at that thing is basically a line, right? There's a line between here, I can imagine that, right? Sort of a line is a spatial thing between two points in that space that you have in your mind. So it's useful technique, but that doesn't mean it exists, right?
That it's been written down, the letters and the forms and the ink and E equals MC squared, like the formulation exists in reality, which I think is kind of sort of pointless. But the third is to say it does not exist in reality. And to me, the big acid test is, what was this thing prior to consciousness? So prior to human consciousness, or you could say prior to the understanding of E equals MC squared, the identification of E equals MC squared, prior to human understanding, it did not exist in the universe as a concept. What did exist, though, was the actual material relationship of matter and energy, right? So
how the hell do you know? You weren't there, right? You're just, extrapolating your experience in the now back through time, right? Time is also a mental construct. So it's like, but when I say there was this back in time when there was no human beings or whatever, back in the time of the dinosaurs, well, it's all a story. It's not a part of your experience. Hume is talking about what is. He's not talking about what was, right? He's not talking about, a million years ago or 100 million years ago, right? He's talking about what is and what is not, right? Why don't you stick to that, right?
Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, right? So that existed. Like gravity existed before it was described or synthesized by Newton and others.
Well, first of all, gravity is not something that exists. For it to exist, it needs to be empirical, right? So what color does gravity have? What sound? Or does it have a color? Does it have a sound? Does it have a smell? Does it have a taste? Does it have a feel, right? It has none of these, right? So gravity is not something that exists. It's a mental construct of some kind which you use as a tool to get around in the world, right? It's not something that is.
The world was round even when people thought it was flat and so on.
And furthermore, how do you know that the world was round before people, whatever, right? Don't fabulate about the past which you have never experienced. And even if you had an experience of what went on a million years ago, now at this point it would only be a memory, right? A memory is not empirical. That's why you call it a memory, right? It's not an experience as such. It's a memory, right? A memory is not empirical because there's no sense data. It's a memory that you bring out for some storage in your mind. That can never be knowledge. A memory is not knowledge because there's no empirical data. There might have been empirical data, but that's just a label you put on the memory and saying this memory was based on some prior prior empiricism. But now it's no longer empiricism. Now it has been classified as a memory. And that means it's not knowledge. It can't be knowledge. Even if you were there with the dinosaurs, right? So that's why he says is and is not. You have to be in empirical situation, and that is only the is and the is not, right? If you say there's an is, and I say that is an is not, well, then we disagree about that reality, but who's right about it? But you can't tell me, and I can tell you, because I don't have your experience, you don't have my experience and I don't have your experience. So we can't compare our propositions, right? So we have to disagree, just to say, okay, we disagree. Well, they go part ways or something like that, right? But we have to talk about the ises and the is nots, right? You can't go back in time and say, well, at the time of the dinosaurs, things were like this. You don't. It's ridiculous, man, right?
And so to me, everything that exists or that existed prior to human consciousness exists independently.
Prior to human consciousness. But the whole idea of existence wasn't in play before somebody was conscious of it, right? How do you have access to something you have never been conscious of, right? Nobody has been conscious of. If you go with the theory, at some point, the first human being was conscious of something, right? That's the first somebody says, hey, I'm conscious of that dinosaur over there, right? Before that, there was nothing to be conscious about. There was no consciousness. You're just, extrapolating whatever it is that somebody potentially was conscious of back through time, right? It's not like when people became conscious at some point, then all of a sudden these oughts appeared in the consciousness, right? An ought is a symptom of a kind of thinking. There's some kind of reaction to how things are, and this other way that things could have been might be that which triggers people into saying that is wrong because it could have been different. That knife didn't have to be inside the heart of that child, right? It could have been outside the child instead, and therefore the child might have survived. So you are wrong because you had the opportunity, according to my understanding of how people work and the things work and the whatever, right? My best explanation of how people argue this is they're actually saying it could have been different because of free will, something like that, right? So therefore you're wrong because you could have chosen something that had a different consequence that would have been better for that which received the consequence of your action. Something like that, right? But that doesn't prove that there's an ought in that is, right? Because you have to point out how you get to that ought. That's what Hume is saying. That you have some emotions or feelings, that doesn't count. That's just your inner workings that you can't put into the world and say it's there because I experience in myself, right? it's also very much about how you argue for this. Because people think that they're just going to describe the world and that it automatically follows that it's right or wrong. That's what Hume is challenging. No, it's not enough to say that, right? But he doesn't say that you have to get an ought from an is, right? He doesn't say that you have to get that. That's a misinterpretation of Hume. He says, if you want to argue this way, then you should bring in a good explanation of how you get to this ought from this is, right? He doesn't say you have to argue for this. There might be some other way to do it, right? There may be some 3 or 4 other ways to argue for morality. Fine. All he says is, if you're going to do it this way, then you at least have to bring some understanding of how you all of a sudden can start to talk about oughts, right? Okay.
Of human consciousness. And so E equals mc squared existed, like what it described existed in reality, but the description did not. Does that sort of make any sense?
It does, but...
That's good. That's right. Yes. You are experiencing something, but your interpretation of the experience is inside you, right? That's why you can't say morality is wrong. No, you can't. You can't say murder is wrong, right? Because murder is defined as something that is wrong. It's a wrong kind of killing. So you can't say murder is wrong. By that you're saying anything about morality. Or you're explaining some kind of morality. You are not. You're just pointing out that a red apple is red, right? You're not saying anything. It's a tautological, in the best understanding, right? If you say murder is wrong, you're saying a wrong kind of killing is wrong. Yes, of course it's wrong, because that's the definition of it, right? So this is one of the tricks that Stefan Molyneux used to circumvent Hume. He's using words and the implicit understanding and, sneaking in morality through the back door this way and say, aha, murder is wrong. So now we got the ought, right? No, you didn't. You just smuggled it in using words, right?
I'm having a different conflict right now. Here's the
no,
deal.
I know. We're not getting to the is ought yet, just so you know. I'm just sort of like trying to get the concept material thing related.
We are not? Didn't you just talk about is's and oughts? I don't get it. No, little peasant, right?
But sorry, go ahead.
The concept I'm having right now is that I used to consider all those concepts as part of the is statements.
That's a good thinking, young man, right? I don't know if you're an old man, but you sound like a young man. That's good thinking, because what is not the colors or the shapes or the sounds or the smells, because they are not unique to any existence, something that is outside of potentially representing something outside, right? What you can call these things that are the concepts, the conceptualization of your experience, right? There's nothing that says just because you experience the color gray that there must be an elephant, or the sound of a trumpet must be an elephant, right? Or the smell of a certain kind of smell of shit may say, okay, this is an elephant, right? There's nothing in this experience itself that must refer to anything that is uniquely existing. The only thing you can refer to is when you experience the concept, or the lively version of the concept, the elephant, right? When you experience the real elephant, the instance of a real elephant, that's when you can talk about existence. Because the mind, for some reason, coalesces this particular instance of experiences into what you call an elephant, right? Then it doesn't become something new, but there's a new graphic user interface, you could say, on your experience, where everything is all of a sudden sort of conceptualized, right? There's the curtains here, the window frame and the glass in the frame, and my chair and my books and my coffee and the kitchen, the watch or the clock on the wall and whatever I have. Everything is conceptualized, right? but it's sort of a flurry of colors and smells and the tastes and feels and so on, right? But those are not the things I refer to when I talk about it. Then I talk about the knives and the coffee and the fence and the window and whatever, right? The chair, right? I don't say, oh, that's a green. Okay, there's a red. Oh, there's a smell of X or Y, right? It's the conceptualization that we call that which is. Then we're referring to what is and what is not, is that there's a sheep or there's not a sheep there, right? There's an elephant, there's not an elephant. There's a lawn, there's not a lawn. Something like that, right? Those are the is's. He's absolutely spot on, right? Listen to your listeners, right, Mr. Molyneux?
Well, but the concepts are not the is statement. E equals mc squared describes a relationship between matter and energy. Now,
But why are you bringing in E equals mc squared? Because you thought that that's just something in the mind. Then it can never be a connection between is and ought, right?
there is a relationship between matter and energy, but the concept that accurately describes that does not exist in reality in the same way. Like gravity, if you drop something from a spaceship and it falls to the Earth at 9.8 meters per second acceleration, there's not a little trail of 9.8, like little text trail, 9.8 meters per second. That is the description of a relationship between mass and gravity and the acceleration from, I guess, a broken orbit into the Earth itself. And so the mathematical description of that relationship does not exist in reality. Gravity, of course, does. We couldn't have evolved as a species without gravity because
Gravity is also a description. It's not something that exists. Gravity is a description of how things behave in a certain situation, where these objects are present and that object is present and so on, right? Gravity doesn't exist, right? You can't experience gravity. You can experience a sheep that falls from a tower, right? But that's not gravity. That's a sheep moving this way onto this object in this position according to that other object with if it's present there, right? If there was a trampoline between the sheep and the floor, well, then there's a new situation. My first situation didn't encompass a trampoline. But if you stick a trampoline in there, then the sheep will behave another way. If you put in, 100 cubic meters of chocolate, well, there's a third way it would happen, right? That's because there's a new situation of things combined this or the other or the third way. The thing about these formulas is you can always use the same formula with different kinds of objects. You just have to say, okay, when this object is present, now it's going to behave this way according to the formula, because there's the new object, right? And if you remove an object, well, then there's another way things will happen. But it's according to the same standard, the same formula, right? This is the generalization. But the formula or the description doesn't say anything about the objects, right? And that is what is there. That is what is. That is knowledge, right? That's what the guy is trying to say. The is all your conceptualization of the world. How these things move in a relation to each other doesn't influence whether or not you can bring in an ought, right?
nothing would stick to the Earth and there'd be no atmosphere. So gravity exists and the acceleration exists, but the concept of describing the acceleration as 9.8 meters per second, that does not exist in reality. And so the is and the ought goes like this. The is the stuff that exists independent of human consciousness.
Well, so you have no access to it, right? So you're saying there's an external world that is outside my experience that I do not experience. But I'm going to tell you about it. Do you have any idea how stupid this sounds? I have my experience, and there's something outside my experience that I don't have access to because it's independent of my mind. And now I'm proceeding to tell you about it. I mean, oh man, right? Come on. Can't you see any problems here? It's a foundational metaphysics, right? Come on, man. You can do it.
Now, there are a number of different states of things that exist in the mind, and we're just going to focus on one, which is a state within the mind that claims to accurately describe.
There's a state within the mind that claims. Do you have little, do you hear voices inside your mind? I'm claiming that this is the case inside my mind. What are you saying? There's something that claims in your mind? Do you hear little voices? Are you possessed or something like that? Bad philosophy.
Describe things in the world, right? So if I'm telling you about a dream I had last night, I'm not claiming that I'm accurately describing things in the world, right? If I tell you about my daydream.
So your mind is not a part of the world. Is that what you're saying? So you're talking about some empirical, objective, rational, true world outside your mind, because your mind is sort of disconnected from it. Well, how do you get access to that thing outside? Because in my understanding, your mind is that which is inside your brain, so to say. Let's put it that way, right? And that reality of yours, that external world, is outside your brain, right? But you have to have your brain to have your experience. And your experience is inside your brain. And then you're saying you have access to that. Are you saying that that thing outside your mind is also the same as that is inside your mind? That little thing inside your brain is actually the exactly same as that whole universe outside your mind. How does that work? How do you get access to that? Is it sort of a deconstruction, and then you is it WinRAR that has compressed the universe into your little mind, and then you just pick it out, and then it's unzipped, and then you have the perfect elephant, or the understanding of the same elephant outside your mind. How do you square this fucking circle, man, right? How do you do this? Your metaphysics is completely screwed. You have no understanding what you're saying.
Dream of becoming a rock star or something, right? I'm not claiming to objectively and accurately describe things in the world. Is that
objectively and accurately? What is that? You dream of an elephant. I'm not accurately describing, but you're referring to elephant, which is a concept that is also a reference to something that can exist. So there is some kind of connection between your dream of an elephant and any kind of real elephant, right? There is some connection, at least at some point in your mental structure, right? So how does this work? It's something that I pointed out in all of my deconstruction of his videos, and particularly of his books, that there's a foundational problem in his metaphysics. The materialist metaphysics is deeply flawed, right? It's kind of madness. It's a self-imposed kind of madness, right? I know that most people in the world approach things this way, and to a large extent, that is how you approach your experience, as if it's something outside yourself. But that you have an experience that you classify as something outside yourself, that doesn't mean that that experience is exactly that which is outside yourself, right? How could it? How can it both be that which is inside yourself and then this exactly same that is outside yourself? How do you get to that conclusion? Because you have nothing to compare it to, because you only have your experience. You're saying that yourself, right? So it's like you have to get your fucking grip on this metaphysics. Otherwise, you're never going to solve anything, because all the rest of your philosophy is based on your freaking metaphysics, right? Your reduction base.
That makes sense?
It does. I can see where you're going, but it still gives me trouble, Stefan, because if I sort of bundle those
we can't solve
descriptive statements...
Just for a moment. I'm sorry to interrupt. Listen, just let's be patient here. This is one of the toughest problems around. Let's not claim we can solve it in 4 minutes.
No. But first of all, you need to understand what Hume is saying. You do not... Well, you can't know that you don't understand it. If you think you understand it, well, then you're heading into solving the problem. But you might back up a little and grab your own test and say, maybe I should get to the quote, right? As you yourself are telling your listener, oh, no, you need to have the quotes, and you need to have the good arguments, and you have to, fundamental, metaphysics and epistemology and objectivity and all these things, right? But you're just riffing from your own self-imposed understanding of Hume, right? Maybe you should go back to the quote and see what he's actually saying and try to work from that. And not give Hume credit or miscredit for something he actually didn't say, right? And Hume is not saying that you should get an ought from an is, right? That's not Hume's quote. That's not what Hume is about. You can interpret it that, okay, but if I need to go to morality, I need to bridge that gap. Fine. But Hume just said, okay, if you're going to do it this way, then just bring in a good argument for how you bridge that gap, right? So Stefan Molyneux thinks that he has to solve this is-ought problem in this that hasn't been done by anybody for 300 years and never ever in the history of human beings, right? Possibly. And now he's sort of patronizing. Oh, you have to be patient, right? He asked, does it make sense what I'm saying? And then the listener says, well, I'm not sure about this. Oh, you should shut up and listen and wait till I'm finished with my, dissertation, right? It's like he's asking the listener to comment. And then when he comments, he says, you shouldn't say that, right? It's sort of, what a dick. What an asshole, right? Give the guy a fucking break. And clearly English is not his first language, right? He's trying his best to express what he thinks and he says, and then you say, oh, don't say that, you shouldn't, you should wait and be patient, little peon. Well, the great philosopher, Eck, is talking to you and you should be patient. Fucking bullshit, right?
Okay, so
Sure,
the fact that we're still thrashing around is totally fine.
Just let me tell where I'm coming from, if it matters. Because if we bundle all the descriptive statements, true or not, in the is part of the equation, the David Hume guillotine kind of makes sense. But I can see where you're going. You were trying to tell me that it's important if the is statement actually corresponds to reality or not. Am I right?
Well, if you're claiming to describe accurately what happens in reality.
No, it's not about claim. You if you say that's an elephant, you don't have the guy next to you won't say, well, are you claiming that that's something that exists, or are you not claiming? Who does that, right? Who does that? If your wife cooks for you, Stefan Molyneux, right? I said that's your salad, right? Are you going to say, are you claiming that there's a true statement that it's an existence of salad? Are you claiming that, or is it just some words you don't do that, right? Come on, man. An is statement is about existence, and existence is about knowledge, right? It's a knowledge statement. It's an existence statement. This exists, this doesn't exist. This exists, this doesn't exist, right? If it moves around, that's the sort of a more like a weakness of Hume's, the way he presents it, but it's sort of an afterthought, so he doesn't delve as deep into it as he might have done, or I would have preferred he would have done, right? I've written a whole book about this maybe, right? To construct or deconstruct what he's trying to say. That would have been nice, but he didn't possibly realize how important this was, right? Even though he had all the moral systems that he had hitherto met with, were all committing this sort of fallacy, right? So he should have pointed out maybe more deeply as an afterthought. Now it would have been nice to understand what it means, right? Maybe there's some of his description is this quote that is sort of dependent on the rest of the book, or the terms he uses and so on, which is sort of 300 years ago, right? So there might be something that is better understood if you have actually read the book. But that doesn't mean you can't bring in the quote standing alone. I mean, the basic idea is foundationally that when you argue this way, he's describing a way of arguing, right? And he's just pointing out this way of arguing doesn't work, right? This is just too simple. You can't just describe the world and then invent more judgments or more commands, right? It's just too simple. It doesn't work that way, right? That's all he's trying to say. And he's alerting the reader that whenever you read somebody claiming to have found some moral whatever, right? Just see if they're not committing this fallacy. And they say you should reject it, basically. It doesn't say that explicitly, but implicitly it's like, well, be careful because they're just screwing with you, right? That's all he's trying to say. When people argue for morality, just check whether or not they're committing this fallacy. You may need to do some deconstruction, because the ought is not the magical word. Ought is something that is the terms that are connected with. They're connected with an ought. It's a placeholder for ought is a description that moral judgment, moral command, whatever it is, right? People are using all kinds of terms that are morally loaded. So the ought is a placeholder for all these kind of terms. So whenever you feel that somebody is starting to venture into moral judgment, check out whether or not they are actually trying to bridge the gap, or they're just starting to say, well, I experienced this, therefore you should or shouldn't, right? And he's not saying that you can't get across this gap, but you just have to explain very distinctly and very clearly how you're doing it. And people might say, yeah, that works. That seems to work. But when you're just saying, well, I bring in a new word, and all, murder is wrong, therefore I have, no, that doesn't work, right?
Then it ought to, by definition, accurately describe what's happening in reality.
Okay, but so now he's bringing in the ought in the description of the reality. How to get to the is an ought, right? So if you're trying to establish reality, then your claim of reality ought to be in conformity with reality. But then there's a problem of this metaphysics, where there's apparently this external world that he doesn't have access to, but which is better than everything he is experiencing. And if you are experiencing something different than this external world, then the external world wins. But at the same time, he only has his experience, because if it's outside his experience, well, how the hell can he experience it, right? And if it's a part of his experience, it can't be an external world, because then it's a part of his experience. So everything is screwed from the ground up. His metaphysics sucks, right? Therefore, he can never get to any philosophy that is good, because it's screwed from the ground up.
Right, so if you say, well, what's called a black hole is actually super dense matter, which light cannot even escape because of the gravity well's effect on the photons or whatever, right? So black hole is just an analogy. It's actually the exact opposite of a hole, which is the densest matter known in the universe, or whatever it is, right? So if you're claiming that your idea, your argument, your equation, your hypothesis, your conjecture, whatever, right? If you're claiming that it accurately describes objective things in the universe, then that is the measure of its truth content. And you could really say the measure of its value, but let's just say truth content. So if I say, according to my theory of gravity, mass attracts mass, well, we can test that, right? We can jump up and see if we are sucked back down into the gravity well of the Earth or whatever. But if I say my theory of gravity is that mass repels mass.
Yes, but mass doesn't repel mass. You don't understand what mass is. Mass is it is an artificial or abstract description of the amount of matter. Right? It's not the weight of things, because matter might be weightless. Then it has no weight. But there's still some matter there, right? And the mass of the matter is the amount of matter present in that coherent object. So you can say mass is a description of how hard it is to change the velocity of that object. The more mass it has, the more force you need to exert on that object to change its velocity. That's the mass. The harder it is to change its velocity, the more mass it has. That's a sort of a pocket version of how to describe that, right? It might be dependent on relativity or something like that. But mass is not what it is. Mass is a description of how much there is, right? Matter is that which is not energy, or matter is that which is sort of composed of atoms or something like that, right? But mass is a description, how much matter is there here, right? So how much matter doesn't attract how much matter, right? You are violating the understanding what mass is. You don't even know basic physics, right? So don't lecture people on understanding of these things if you don't understand them. Okay, it may be a misquote. You might have wanted to say matter attracts matter. Okay, fine. But why did you say mass attracts mass? It's like you have no conception of the difference between mass and matter. Another point is matter doesn't attract matter, right? If you understand Einstein, the point is rather that space and existence or the presence of matter in space distorts space. And that distortion, if some other matter comes flying by, will press that matter into the bigger lump of matter, right? If there's more mass here, the less mass will be pressed towards the more mass, right? The bigger mass. So it's not because they attract each other, it's because space is pressing them together. So you don't even understand that either. So don't lecture people about something you do not understand.
Right, then I'm saying that I'm accurately describing reality, but then we jump up and of course...
Well, you're not accurately describing reality. You're fucking full of bullshit. You don't understand it, right? So, I mean, it's like you're arguing for how it's important to describe reality correctly. And then you're proceeding to, show how ignorant you are of the understanding of reality, right? It's kind of, you're so full of bullshit, man, right? How can anybody take this shit seriously? You have no clue what you're doing, right? You're just juggling around words and say, aha, I've solved the problem, right?
Of course, I shouldn't even be on the earth if mass repels mass. And since the empirical reality contradicts my concept,
So what does, if reality is outside your mind, right? And you have access to it, why do you need empiricism? Because then you're saying, well, I need the experience of it to have access to it. But if you're saying, well, there's the mind and then there's this outside, how did you circumvent that mind thing and empiricism? You have to have the experience, the empirical experience of it to understand it. And when did you get anything else but your empiricism? So you're locked within your empiricist understanding. You do not have anything else but your empiricism, right? So you can't talk about the external reality because you need to experience it before you can talk about it, right? And you can't talk about anything other than your experience because you need that experience. How can you not see this? How can you not understand this? Duh.
my concept has a negative truth value. There's no such thing as a neutral truth value when it comes to a statement about objective reality. It's either true or it's false. There's no neutral. I mean, I guess you could say it's undetermined or whatever.
Yeah. That can be, if you are calling me on the phone from Paris and saying, I am, the Eiffel Tower is true, and I'm in the other end of the phone and I'm sitting in, Stockholm, I'm going to say, well, I can't say it's false. I can't say it's true either. I don't have empirical data. So I have to say, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know is a very important thing. But you might also, if you're saying, okay, we are both standing, in a big field on Earth, right? And you're saying the Earth is spherical. I would have to say, I don't know. From my vantage point, I can't see the whole globe. So I can't say to you it's spherical because I can't experience all of that which are claimed in the proposition. So I have to say, I don't know, I can't say it's not spherical. Because if I'm not experiencing that which it is claimed to be, I can't reject I can't neither confirm or, the opposite? Reject the claim in the proposition. So I have to say, I don't know, right? That's as important as true or false, in my opinion. But in all other cases where you can encompass the object, either by, you have to experience it and you have to experience all of it, right? If you're a flea on an elephant and the flea next to you say, that's an elephant, the other flea would have to say, well, I don't know, right? I don't know, because if you can't see all the elephant, you can't say that it's an elephant, right? You can say, I have the theory that's an elephant. I'm working from the theory that's an elephant. Fine, do that. Do whatever you want, right? But don't claim that you know it, right? That's another thing. A theory or you're going with an idea is not the same as knowing the idea, right?
It is, but that's outside of the entire continuum. So if I say either mass has no effect on mass in either attraction or repulsion, or I say mass...
Again, mass is a description of the amount of matter. So it's like saying kilogram has an effect on kilogram. But what how stupid is that, right? Weight, or rather weight, has influence on weight. I said, well, what the hell are you talking about? You don't understand what you're saying, right? Okay, there may be mass and matter. These are two words that sound very much like each other, but they're completely different, right? Okay.
Repels mass, but that's very easy to test, and it's proven false. So the ought does not exist in reality. The ought exists in the claim that what I'm saying accurately describes reality. And since I'm saying that my concept accurately describes reality, the ought is that it should. But that's...
Well, what if you don't say? Okay, what if you say that's an elephant? And you say, well, are you claiming that the elephant is there? No, I'm just saying elephant. Then it's like you want to, oh, can I put that ought in there? Or I want to put an ought in there or there or there. Oh, I can put in an ought, right? Oh, when you say that, you ought to be right, and then there's the ought, and then I prove an ought, and I kind of go and moralize all I want because I've proven that there's an ought. Bullshit, right?
It's because I'm making a claim that says my concept accurately describes things in the real world, and so now we have an ought, which is based upon my claim that it does. Does that make sense?
So when you claim something, you're creating oughts. I mean, do you have any idea how stupid that sounds? Because you have an ought in your head doesn't mean that there's an ought out there, right? Because you claim that something is true. There's no ought there, right? And the ought, you are misusing the term ought, right? You're just saying, well, because Hume is using the term ought, I am going to use the term ought, and I'm going to be a sophist about it, and you put in ought in somewhere, and say, aha, solve the problem. You don't understand. Hume was trying to say ought is a placeholder for moral statements, right? They are not about describing reality. You don't understand what he's saying. He's saying describing reality, to all of a sudden go, therefore you do this, therefore you shouldn't do that, therefore you must do this, and therefore you are duty bound to do that, or whatever, right? All kinds of moral statements over here that he just labeled it. These are the oughts, right? Any kind of verbal description of how things are in reality, those are the ises, right? Otherwise, he would have to be, there's the is, and there's the existence, and there's the being, and then there's the oughts and the duties that you should do, you must do, the evil and the good, and that would blow up the whole sentence, right? So he just said, okay, there are ises, and that's the oughts, right? There's nothing magical about the term ought, right? You should understand this. I mean, what level are you philosophizing on, right? You're completely blown. It's so ridiculous what you're trying to argue here, right? Anybody in their right mind should outright reject this as bullshit, right? You have no clue what you're talking about, okay? I'm not going to get deeper into this because, I mean, I rest my case, right? Is just throwing around words and saying, aha, I solved the problem, right? Get the fuck out of here, right? Get the fuck out of here. Please share, like, and subscribe, and throw in a comment or two. Hume says, or it was one of my, dear children, right? It's so lovely that people either don't know about it, or those who think they know about it have misunderstood what he's saying, right? In my opinion. And, and if you want more of this kind of stuff, well, consider giving me a donation. Links below, right? So otherwise, have a very nice day. See you next time.